A long time ago, in the far, far north, there was a boy who was always hungry. And one time, his grandmother looked up from her sewing and said, "Hey boy, you've eaten all the whale meat. Hey boy, you've gobbled all the seal. Hey boy, you've even guzzled the fish oil. If you want anything else to eat, go out and get it yourself." Well, thought the boy, I am still hungry. And so he slipped on his boots. Do you see these boots here? Just like that. As many of the objects and artifacts in the exhibition here at RAMM in Exeter will show you just the sorts of clothes and tools that were used by the people in this story, the Inuit people who still live in parts of northern Canada. So he slips on his clothing, an anorak too, and he leaves the shelter of the igloo. He goes out into the land of the midnight sun, and he walks over the frozen snow, crunch, 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 until he comes to the sea. And there, just beneath the surface, he can see a codfish. He plunges his hands into the water, he grabs the fish by his tail, he whirls it round and around his head, he opens up his mouth and swallows the fish right down. But he's still hungry. He walks along the frozen shore and sees a seal. Up to the seal he goes, he grabs it by its tail, lifts it up, whirls it round his head, and would you believe, yes, he opens up his mouth and swallows the whole seal down, but he's still hungry. Over there he sees a walrus. Over he goes, he grabs it by its tail. This great big beast is whirling through the air. This boy opens his mouth and swallows the walrus down. But he's still hungry. What's that over there? It's a polar bear. Up to there he goes, he picks it up by its tail, whirls it round and around and around and around and around and around and around. He opens up his mouth and down goes the bear, but he's still hungry. What's that out at sea? A great white whale. Beluga! How can he do it? But he does. He stretches out his arms, his telescopic arms. Into the cold water they plunge. He scoops up the whale by its tail, and round and around and around it goes until down it goes. And now the boy is full, and he heads for home, singing his favorite song. Have you ever heard Inuit singing? Sometimes two people, they stand facing each other, nose touching, and one person says something, a sound that goes into the other person's mouth, and then they twist their mouth to make another sound, which then goes back into the other person's mouth. Not the sort of singing I'd recommend these days during you-know-what. He gets back to the igloo, but he's so big. He bangs his belly against the doorway. Grandma, I've eaten too much. I can't get into the igloo. If I stay out here much longer, I'll freeze. And Granny, she looks up from her sewing and says, hey, boy, if you can't get in through the doorway, try the window way. And the boy thinks, Granny's usually right. And he goes around the igloo. But when he gets to the window way, he says, but Grandma, I can't even get my head through the window way. What will I do if I stay out here much longer? I'll freeze. And Granny says, hey, if you can't get in through the window way, try to get through the smoke hole. And he looks down at the smoke hole and says, Grandma, I can't even get my nose through the smoke hole. If I stay out here any longer, I'll freeze. And Granny says, well, if you can't get through the doorway, and you can't get through the window way, and you can't get through the smoke hole, try and get through the eye of my needle. Can you see the eye of that needle? Do you think you could squeeze through there? Don't give up so quickly. Try. And now the boy, he looks at that tiny hole in that whalebone needle. And the story gets even stranger than it has been before, for he hears a humming sound in his ears, and everything begins to swirl around, and the next thing, well, as he shrunk, or as the needle got larger, for he's falling through the smoke hole into the igloo, and he feels himself squeezing through the tiny hole in that needle. But then, as he comes out the other side, it's like he's been blown up like a bubble. As he floats towards the floor, why, it's too late. He sees the seal oil lamp and he floats down, and then there's a big explosion. Lots of snow and ice slowly falling to the ground. And there is Grandma, who says, oh, what have I done? I've popped my grandson. I only meant to teach him a lesson. Poor Grandma. She begins to cry, and the warm tears trickle down her face and then drip off her chinny chin, and they land upon the ground. And now you'll find we really are in a fairy story, because if any of this story was true, well, as I'm sure many of you know, in the Arctic, goodness me, if you cry and your tears fall to the ground, they will have frozen by the time they get there. If you were to boil a kettle and throw it in the air, the water would turn to snow just like that. But this is an Inuit fairy tale. As she cries and cries and cries, a pool of water forms around her feet. She cries and cries and cries, and the salt water rises up. Now it's to her knees. She cries and cries and cries, and the water level rises up to her belly button. She cries and cries and cries. There's a pool of water up to her shoulders, and then she stops. Imagine Granny's head being like a rock in the sea, a tiny island. And then Granny notices There's something swimming in the water around her. There's a codfish. And behind the codfish, there's a seal. And behind the seal, there is a walrus. And behind the walrus is swimming, a polar bear. And behind the polar bear, there is the great white whale. And who's sitting on top of that great whale? You're right. It's the grandson. When Grandma sees the little boy, she smiles like the sun itself, and all of the water disappears. And there, what's left? Well, the fish, the seal, the walrus, the polar bear, and the whale. And the boy hops off the whale and goes up to Grandma and said, "Grandma, look what I've brought home. I've brought back all of this for us." And the rest of the day, they make an igloo. And the next day, they have all of those creatures. Now, I know that, I guess you guys, you go shopping at the supermarkets, your local stores, and you get all the food and all of the tools that you need. But you know, up in the frozen north, well, they don't have supermarkets. And there are people who still live up there today. And look at some of these objects here. Musical instruments, harpoons, weapons, all made from the bones and the skins of the creatures that live in the Arctic. Just the way that this needle here that Granny used. Do you remember what this needle's made of? Not plastic, not wood, but bone, real whale bone. And that, I hope you'll agree, is a whale of a tale.